Welcome back to the Underworld Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Danny Gold, and today I am here with Neil Brandvold, who is an amazing cinematographer, director of photography, producer, all that, documentarian, who has worked all over the world, all over the Middle East, Afghanistan, Africa, all over. I know he's done a lot of work in Congo, Liberia, all that, and especially in Latin America. He was actually the guy who helped me put together the documentary I did for The Guardian about gang members in El Salvador that were becoming evangelical Christians to get out of the gang. He spent a couple of years in El Salvador, I think 4 or 5. He's done documentaries for almost everyone. I mean, there's very few people who know the situation better than he does. And today we're going to talk about everything that's been going on in El Salvador the last couple of years. You know, there's been insane stories about the murder rate going down over 90%, but also stories about the really aggressive, some would say, complete violations of human rights happening in El Salvador with suspected gang members and a lot of innocents getting caught up in it. So Neil is going to break all of that down for us today and just tell us about some of the stuff he was seeing there before he left the country recently. Neil, thank you so much for being here with me and all that. But right off the bat, you know, I just saw an article that said something like murders in El Salvador were down something 95%, 98%, which, you know, having worked there with you is just insane. I mean, what do you make of all that? Is that real?
I mean, it's really crazy. The last film that we did, I tried to get to every historically famous gang controlled neighborhood. And you throw don't talk about human rights, don't talk about anything like that. Like, really, the gangs have been pretty much dismantled in El Salvador from how they were working before. I was out by myself at 2:00 in the morning with my camera gear, walking around the Campanera, Mexicanos, like the worst of the worst. With it's a full military occupation, but the gangs are not there. And if they're there, they're in hiding and they're not operating. So those numbers are definitely pretty. I mean, the government is definitely hiding a lot of the murders. There's been a lot of reporting on that, but the numbers, I mean, it's obvious they're nowhere near they were like when you and I were reporting back then, like when, you know, you're getting weekends of hundreds of people murdered in a weekend and just like crazy numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, the last time it really went down, or one of the last few times, it was before I think we both had gotten there. You know, they said the murder rate was down a lot, but it turned out that they were just hiding the bodies and the government wasn't counting them. This isn't that though, right? It seems like this is actually, it's really gone down a significant amount.
Yeah, it's definitely really gone down a significant amount, and the government is hiding some, but not even to scale with what we're talking about, what El Salvador used to be. So you're talking about, you know, there's the human rights issues are really big. It's like you're in a military occupied country, like complete occupation, every neighborhood. But the gangs not murdering people like they used to. They're still finding, you know, some mass graves. The gangs are still killing people here and there. The government's doing its best to hide those murders. But yeah, it's like another world there. It's really pretty crazy.
And then in terms of like the extortion, which is how the gangs made a lot of their money, like is that still everywhere, or has that gone down a lot too?
That's totally gone down too. And what's really interesting is before they would do these campaigns, it's like, if you're getting extorted, call this number. And nobody was going to call the number because they knew, you know, likely the police were in on it, or they would come back around and they would get murdered for reporting it. So no one reported. And now with the military, there's this like new sense of trust, and people are actually calling, reporting, and not paying. I mean, I spoke to a lot of people that are not paying extortion anymore. Even if the gang shows up at their house, they're saying, no, I'm not paying you.
Whoa. I mean, yeah, it's like, I can't even imagine what the country is like now. Just from the previous trips I've made, it was never. Yeah, that was just not a situation that happened.
Well, and that we ever thought could even happen. I was like, all my time there, I never thought that this could happen.
And then in terms of how this was accomplished, is it just arresting literally everyone and just brutal police methods? Because that actually, I mean, that's not new, right? The police there had been doing extrajudicial stuff before. So like, what has what has changed in terms of like this actually being successful?
So I think there's a couple different things. This is so they call it like the Iron Fist policies. They're called, you know,
Super Iron Fist.
Yeah, there was like Iron Fist 1, Iron Fist 2, Super Iron Fist, Super Iron Fist, Super Plan Control Territory. Like it just was ridiculous. But this time, I think before, with all of its problems, there was still some sort of respect of like a judicial process. They didn't go as hard as they're going. Like Bukele has gone. I mean, tanks in the street, like in a lot of places, it doesn't even make sense. But this military presence, you'd be in like a small neighborhood, for instance, like La Campanera, that's like slums, houses on top of houses. And it was surrounded with tanks. I'm like, what are you going to do with a tank? Like blow up 5 houses to get one gang? Like but it was this full military occupation. Now we're well over a year now, I think a year and 4 months of complete martial law where there's no due process, no access to an attorney, and they can arrest anyone for anything, and you're just thrown in the prison. I mean, and in 1 year, they arrested about 2% of their population in a year.
And the crazy thing is, and I mean, this is no defense, right? But Bukele has major popular support, you know, and it's kind of like I do understand it, right? Like it's easy to look at it from the outside, right? Mm-hmm. You know, but I'm not the one who had to live under the gangs, right? Like, so in some ways, like I do sort of understand why a lot of Salvadorans do support him despite the sort of brutal methods. I mean, is it hard for you to reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely has huge support. And I think you said it exactly the truth. I mean, like, we're not the ones that were having, like, you know, our daughters weren't getting kidnapped and raped by the gangs, you know, as soon as they turned 13, 14. You know, our kids weren't getting recruited or chopped up into little pieces. We weren't getting, you know, I think a lot of people never will really understand how bad El Salvador really was unless you lived it, you know. And even as a journalist, I didn't live it. I wasn't living in those neighborhoods really, like, you know, we were out covering the crime beat and everything. But I think it's hard to understand how bad things were. I mean, it was the highest murder rate in the world outside of Syria for years.
Yeah.
Which is insane.
Yeah, because it essentially was a war, you know, like these gangs were warring.
So yeah, I was just going to add, like, I just think it's like, when you look at it from that perspective, I think a lot of people are like, do whatever, we don't care. Like, democracy is new there. It's, you know, the Civil War ended in the early 90s and democracy is still fairly new, and how has it been working for them? And I think a lot of people were like, you know what, like, throw human rights out the window. We don't care about anything. Just get rid of these gang members. Like, just get rid of them. We don't care how you do it. Just do it. And even, I mean, I have just like some anecdotes from the last film, but like I interviewed a guy that was thrown into prison for a month, saw like 5 people tortured and murdered in front of him. He was tortured. He finally was able to get released from prison by some miracle, who knows how. And he came out and he's like, oh, I support Bukele. I think what he's doing is right. Like, dude, they just tortured you, man. And he's like, well, you know, it's the price that we pay.
Yeah. I mean, it's people there have been through a lot. And I guess maybe some of them figure I'd rather the government be doing this than the gangs. At least then maybe I have a chance. I don't know. I'm just assuming what the mind state is. But I want to get more into Bukele and what he's done. I know you've done a bunch of interviews, I think, with him. And I even remember when we were working together, I think in like 2017, he was mayor then. And you were talking about like, you were like, you got to watch out for this guy. Like, this guy's on the rise. I don't remember the exact words you told me, but it was something along those lines where you were like, pay attention. He was the mayor of San Salvador then.
Yeah. And so I was like, he had just a super quick trajectory and like we could see it coming. And I just think nobody realized like how big he was going to be, like how, like, I mean, he would just take over the entire country. He's completely taken over the entire country. And I don't think we ever saw it being that big. I mean, he's a young guy. He's like our age.
Yeah, which is crazy. And I remember, you know, I've been reading now to people like, you know, in other Latin American countries are like chanting his name because they see what he's done to the sort of like, you know, a lot of these people have lived with such high levels of violence from gangs, from cartels, for things like that, that he has this kind of almost groundswell of support for what he's doing, like not just in El Salvador, but across the region in some places.
Yeah, so you see like in Honduras, they're adopting, like they're trying to mimic the whole plan. Ecuador, like a bunch of countries are trying to mimic it. And when you go work in those countries, you'll get people on the ground that's like, what we really need is a Bukele.
Yeah.
Which is hard to stomach sometimes when you see all the bad stuff going on. You're like, I get this, but like you guys, there's prices that are going to be paid down the road that people are paying right now, but also down the road. Like this dismantling of democracy never ends well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I just got an email from someone at the International Crisis Group about a report they just did on Honduras. And I haven't read it yet, but I assume it's about similar stuff than what you're talking about right now. But yeah, let me pull back for a minute. Tell us kind of like, tell me about when you moved to El Salvador, kind of why you moved there and what it was like when you first got there.
Yeah, so when I first moved, I've been freelancing based out of DC and doing like trips. I was like going to Congo, going different places. And I was like, I really want to go someplace that I can kind of dig my teeth in and spend a bunch of time and really be on the ground kind of long term. The idea was to focus on immigration, like child migration stories back then, and got in and like immediately got swept up into gang stories. Like I was doing stuff on people getting deported, and you're like, what happens when you get deported? Well, you get recruited by the gang or extorted by the gang or murdered by the gang. And then it rapidly went into like, I was doing like they call it La Nota Roja, where you just basically do the homicide beat, like all night long. You're just bouncing from like murder scene to murder scene. And it was crazy back then. I mean, it was the gangs. It was also, I mean, it was hard to explain that when people would come in. It was hard for me to understand. I feel like the first year I was there, I didn't know what was going on. Like everything I assumed was wrong. And then when people would come in, you're like, no, like literally one gang, like from street to street is controlled by opposing gangs. And if you live on one street and your mom lives on the other street, you literally cannot cross the street to go to her house, or they could kill you. And the level of gang control was so high, and the level of violence was just so out of control.
How did you make inroads into the gangs, into covering this sort of stuff?
So I was when I first got there, I worked with different fixers, and then started to befriend local journalists. So I started working more and more closely with the guys at El Faro, who are do amazing work. Like they're the investigative journalists for El Salvador. Like everything they do is really great. And so I started just embedding with them, and then the local journalists, I just started following them. So I got in with these. There's a group of like 5 guys that do just the crime beat, La Nota Roja. And so I just started going out with them all the time. And it'd be, 1, 2 in the morning, we'd be just driving through the craziest gang neighborhoods, chasing homicides. And that's how I started to kind of like figure out how the country worked, where things were. It was like a way to get into those neighborhoods. That was really, it was pretty scary, pretty gnarly. But then little by little, just kind of making inroads through there. And then with the gang stuff, it really was my and starting to understand really how the gangs worked was through our mutual friend, Wilfredo, who was running a rehabilitation program for ex-gang members. And he started to kind of guide me in how things worked. And then little by little branching out and doing kind of more serious gang reporting.
Yeah, you were the guy who brought me into that, and I think you were reported. I mean, I assume you're still friends with Wilfredo, and you've done a lot of stories on that. Can you kind of tell people, who Wilfredo was and what that story was all about?
Yeah, Wilfredo. I mean, he's amazing. This just like gem of a person. But he was a high-ranking member of 18th Street, from El Salvador, but living in Los Angeles, and was eventually deported for some things some crimes. Came back to El Salvador and kind of rose up the ranks, and wound up spending a bunch of time in prison. And in prison, he almost died and found Jesus and started this movement of like evangelical ex-gang members. And he led this huge march of gang members to leave the gang and become evangelical Christians, which was really interesting because traditionally, there's no way to leave. Like to leave the gang it's a death sentence. Like you don't leave the gang. But little by little, there like became this. They started to understand that it was okay, or they started to allow people to leave the gang if they became evangelical Christians. But you had to be very strict evangelical Christian. Like they would check up on church, like make sure you were in church every Sunday. If they caught you smoking a cigarette in the street, they would kill you on the spot. And this happened. I mean, I followed this church for years. And this was happening over and over. So like the gang monitored to make sure you were living the Jesus life. So Wilfredo was running this, like, basically it was like a program for ex-gang members. The only one that exists in El Salvador. There's a couple small churches that did it, but the government had no reinsertion rehabilitation program for gang members. So if you left the gang, you were just kind of, especially if you're covered in tattoos, like you weren't going to get a job. You weren't going to work anywhere. The gangs likely would kill you. And Wilfredo was providing this kind of out through his church. And that's where kind of we picked up and we did our film with him and with Pastor Arias, who was like the MS-13 version of Wilfredo.
Yeah. What's been happening with those guys since Bukele's crackdown?
Yeah, so it's really sad. So we're talking the only rehabilitation program in El Salvador for gang members, which is really crazy if you think about, a war zone where there's, normally they call them DDR, like demobilize, disarm, reinsertion programs. El Salvador doesn't have that. So you leave the gang, there's no way out. And so Wilfredo was providing that way out. When Bukele announced the martial law, the state of exemption, he just wanted to round up and make pictures of as many gang members that he could get. And so Wilfredo's church was an easy target. He had about 30 guys with face tattoos in there. We all know that, these are ex-gang members who've, risked their lives to not be in the gang. They were the first place to get raided. So like within the first week, Will's church was raided. All of the ex-gang members were thrown in prison, pictures taken of them. They were put all over the news. Pastor Arias, who we followed within the first week, he was also thrown in prison. And I think right now there's maybe a handful of guys that are not in prison. And Wilfredo is one of them. He's been very lucky, but very cautious. But the rest of his church, that whole thing is over. The reinsertion program is done, and all of those guys are in jail again.
Yeah, I mean, one crazy thing I think about, and you were talking about this before, you've told me about this, and I think you've reported on it, and it's not unfamiliar to presidents of El Salvador that, Bukele first had this sort of, I don't know whether you call it reputation or reporting that he had actually been making pacts with the gangs.
Yeah, and this has been, he, through his whole time when he was mayor of San Salvador, he was making pacts with the gang. And this isn't new. Basically, every politician was working with the gangs to operate. It was just, if you want to have a political rally in a neighborhood, you needed to pay off the gang at some level to be able to have your political rally. Like, every politician was dealing with them. Bukele on a bigger level, partially because he was in San Salvador. So we're dealing with like downtown San Salvador market, which is like a hub of extortion. So he was doing that. But then when he became president, originally he had this ongoing pact with both gangs, basically to lower the homicide rate, and he would give them benefits in prison. And he released a bunch of these high-level gang members. A bunch of them wound up in Mexico. There's quite a few right now that wound up in the United States and were arrested and are facing federal court in New York right now, where it's going to be interesting to see what these guys say about the pacts with Bukele. But there's audio recordings. There's the evidence is overwhelming about how he had made these pacts with these guys. Eventually that fell apart, and the way the gang always negotiates is with dead bodies. And so when they felt like they weren't getting a fair shake from their negotiation with Bukele, in a weekend they killed over 100 people, basically to demand a better deal. And he responded no, and that's when the martial law started. He was like, I'm not doing this, and he hit the gang really hard. And I don't think anybody, I've talked to all of the investigative journalists, nobody really saw how hard he was going to go.
So it just switched like that, like over one weekend, he was like, enough, and then just went after them extremely hard.
Yeah, like they murdered a bunch of people, and he was just like, I'm not doing this. Like the truce has fallen apart. We know that there's still dealings with the gangs, and people are getting released from prison that are, wanted by the U.S. government. High-ranking members of the gangs are getting released. Like there's still things going on, but for the most part, it was just this like, I'm sending all the soldiers out. Martial law. There's basically no more like fuck human rights. We're going after these guys, and the country changed like overnight.
What's he like? You've met him one-on-one. You've kind of watched his career rise, and he's I guess like one of these world leaders right now that people are just kind of fascinated by, whether it's the gang stuff or just like the trolling that he does on Twitter, which sometimes he's kind of funny. He has a couple jokes.
He's got his moments.
Yeah.
He's interesting. I really didn't see because I interviewed him a bunch of times before he was president, and then actually in his political campaign, like the day before he was elected, I spoke with him, and he was always talking about reinsertion programs and how the only way to fix the gang problem is through social programs and education and job opportunities. And I really thought that Bukele was different. He was narcissistic, young. All of those things, but I kind of had a different expectation of him. And then when he came to power, everything, like his ego went through the roof, and he started adopting a bunch of Trump lines. He and Donald Trump became buddy, and he just like everybody, the media was George Soros, Ron, and there was this big conspiracies. He started attacking journalists and just like kind of went off the deep end. I think a lot of people, like, a lot of these people you follow, and all of a sudden they just like go down the rabbit hole, and you're like, wait, what's going on, man?
Yeah, I've seen it happen with reporters, man.
Yeah.
But there was a period too. He was like aggressively going after some of the El Faro journalists, people had to flee the country and things. It
got really scary. I've always told people when we were reporting before, like pre-Bukele, the fear was always gangs. The gang, like I'd have death threats against me. Like you had to be really cautious that you wouldn't make them angry, or like how you would operate in certain neighborhoods. Like the gangs were always what you were afraid of. Post-Bukele, it's the government. I mean, I think 22 journalists had their phones infected with Pegasus. My colleagues at the DEA and State Department told me Pegasus is like the least of our concerns. He's like, what they have is way more. They're just monitoring everything. I mean, I was detained maybe 5 times my last 3 months in El Salvador while reporting. The government was threatening messages like, we know what neighborhood you're in. Like I'd be in La Campanera and they're like, we know you're in La Campanera right now. And like, it really spiraled into this like attacks on journalism, and then attacks on any kind of human rights organization. So Human Rights Watch became Homies Rights Watch, is what he was calling them. Or like he was going after Amnesty International. Basically anyone that spoke out against him became a target in like a very Trumpian kind of way.
And then when they were going after you, was it because they were accusing you of like associating with the gangs? Like was it that sort of situation, or was it more just reporting in general?
It was mostly reporting. So it was mostly reporting in general. I had kind of like a long-standing reputation with them. There was some fallout. So Bukele, he has a Department of Social Cohesion, is what they call it, Tejido Social. And the head of that, Carlos Marroquin, El Slip, is a gang member. Everybody knows this. Like he is a gang member, and he's also a politician. And he was really unhappy with some of the reporting I did about gangs because he felt like it made the gangs look bad. But then this guy is now a politician under Bukele. So I think that there was kind of like a groundswell of Bukele people that were not happy with me. And they also knew that I was reporting on human rights issues, illegal detainments, torture in prison, things like that they weren't happy about. And so they were really they were going hard after all journalists. But yeah, it was a scary time. The other thing to remember is El Salvador, with the journalists, it's a small community. It's not like a Mexico City where there's, hundreds and hundreds of journalists, thousands of journalists. Like we're a small group of journalists in El Salvador. There's, El Fado's, maybe a dozen people. There's like, I think for a long time, I was the only international journalist based there long term.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like I have this cognitive dissonance there, because it's kind of like you're talking about the guy who's in charge is mad at you for making the gangs look bad.
Yeah. As
you're also making the government, like it's you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't at that point.
Absolutely. And that's the interesting thing with the Bukele. I mean, like he doesn't like, I will always go on about like Carlos Marroquin. Everyone knows this guy is a gang member. El Slip is a gang member, but he's still the head of Social Cohesion.
Yeah.
Like he's on camera doing deals, and like he personally smuggled out high-ranking gang members to Guatemala, and it's all documented. Like he personally went into the prison, took out high-ranking MS-13 gang members, drove them to Guatemala, and released them. People that were on the U.S. most wanted list.
Is that is this part of the reason why you left El Salvador? Just tired of dealing with all that?
Yeah, like I've thought about it a lot, especially now that I've been out for a couple months. I think, in all honesty, I think I probably would have been fine. In a worst case scenario, I might have been deported. So Bukele put down a 15-year prison sentence for reporting on the gangs. This very broad, whatever that means, reporting on the gangs. I think basically if you do something that they don't like, but they would legally be able to throw you in prison for 15 years. And I think for me, like living there long term, just the anxiety of the long haul of always, first it was gangs, then the government, and getting messages, getting, spied on, detained. Eventually I was like, mental health. I got to get out of here for a little bit. It's been enough is enough.
Yeah. I mean, where do you see it all going?
I think that's going to be the interesting thing. I don't think that this is like we said earlier, there's been a million Mano Duros or versions of it. It's never lasted and it's never worked. So they've built this mega prison, the largest prison in the world, that they've built in El Salvador. They've arrested 70,000 people in a year. But what do you do economically? Do they keep them in there forever? I don't know. And the other thing is, to me, like I think about like working Afghanistan stuff. As long as there's a military occupation, sure, the gang's not going out in the streets because there's 1,000 soldiers walking up and down the streets. But is that sustainable? And so when those soldiers leave, are they really going to be able to keep the gangs out? I don't know. The whole other flip side of this that I think will be really interesting is more on the economic scale, on the economic level. Like Bukele has been blowing money like left and right that the government doesn't have. He's made this huge Bitcoin gamble that is really not panning out very well for them as much as they want to pretend it is. I mean, he bought at the majority of their Bitcoin when it was like at 46,000. Like just the worst time to buy it.
It's at 31,000 right now. I think something around that.
But like at one point it hit like 17,000. I think.
Hey, who among us has not blown money they shouldn't be spending on stupid crypto investments?
Right?
You know, I can't fault the guy for that. You know, especially if it's someone else's money and not his own.
Yeah,
like, you know.
Well, and he jokes about it. He's like, "Oh yeah, I'm buying all this Bitcoin while I'm naked on my toilet." Like he tweeted that.
Yeah.
But the sad thing is, like, this is money is coming from the Department of Education budget, and I
didn't know that.
Yeah, and so like the universities are super underfunded right now. The hospitals are like crumbling, but they built like this giant they call it Chivo Pets, like a pet hospital, because it plays well to like the Bitcoin crowd of like, look at your Bitcoin is saving dogs and cats in El Salvador.
That is a good way to win Americans' hearts right there.
Right?
You know, treating sick animals. What about, I mean, how has it affected, you know, migration, immigration, all that sort of stuff? Because lots of people from El Salvador were fleeing because of the gangs, 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Has that slowed down now? Are there different sorts of people, like young men fleeing now because of the aggressive government push against them? Like, where is that all shaping out?
It looks like the numbers are about the same as they were when they're looking. I mean, basically those numbers are kind of, it's a guess of like how many people are being caught at the U.S. border is basically how they gauge those numbers. It's looking pretty close to the same. Like just anecdotally, my experience is like more wealthy Salvadorians abroad that are able to go buy, you know, what they're calling now Surf City. They can go buy their beach house. They're coming back. But your average Salvadoran, like people in my last film are fleeing because they're like, I could be arrested at any point. Like our main character in our Fault Lines film, they arrested his daughter and his wife, and they were not gang members. I mean, we did like all kinds of verifications. These are like an old evangelical lady that worked as a tailor, like definitely not gang members, but they arrested them both. And then the police keep showing up at his house and he's like running around hiding. And last message I got from him a couple days ago was like, I'm going to the United States. I can't live here anymore.
Damn. Let me just stop for a second. Is there a way to turn off whatever that
was there like a click, click, click?
Yeah, like it sounds like crickets or like a sprinkler or something.
Yeah, one sec. I live on a farm.
That's awesome. Oh, was it crickets?
Yeah, it was crickets. Sorry.
Kind of nice. I like that sound.
Crack the window to have a ciggy.
No, it's all good, dude. When you were dealing with the gangs, I mean, were there different calculations you had to make in terms of threats and things like that, like hairy moments that you had to deal with? Or was it kind of like, you know, when I was down there, obviously you feel a little threatened, but you always kind of, I at least had this kind of thing where like, it's like this foreign reporter privilege, you know, like people don't want a dead foreign reporter on their hands in El Salvador.
And that's kind of like what the modus operandi was. We were like, they really don't want, but you wouldn't push it. Like we would follow.
Right, and you got to worry about the people that you're working with that are down, you know, the Salvadorans that you're working with.
Yeah.
That's the concern.
Like I still tell people the story from when you and I were reporting and like the little girl came up. And I'm like this tiny little girl came up and she's like, it's time for you guys to go. And that means it's time to go. It's not the little girl that's going to chase us out. But it was like always having that respect of, you know, security and like the gang control that when it's time to go, it's time to go. And if they don't want you to film something, you don't film it. It got really tricky after I did Unforgivable. The film I did with like Patrick Tumbala and some guys at El Faro and Marlene Pinayo.
Can you tell everyone what that film is about? Because it's wild.
Yeah, so we
did a couple films like that because you were on Transition too, right?
Yeah, I did Transition too, the Afghanistan one. So the Unforgivable, we spent three weeks basically around the clock inside an isolation ward in the maximum security prison in Gotera. And we'd found a cell, an isolation ward of 18th Street and MS-13 guys living together, which never happens, but they were also in homosexual relations. And they'd chosen to isolate themselves in this cell for their own security because you'd be murdered for being gay or you'd be murdered for being friends with, the other gang.
Jesus.
So we made this film, and then after that, the gang response was like very serious. I was getting messages that we were greenlit for murder from really trusted sources, and had to go into hiding. And that basically ended my time doing gang stories. Like I was not going into a gang neighborhood to report after that film came out.
Whoa, I didn't know it got that serious. But yeah, I mean, I remember hearing what that film was about, and I think it won a bunch of awards, right? And being like, this is the craziest story that anyone could ever find in El Salvador.
Yeah, it was just and it was the wildest thing because you're hanging out and like, you've seen it. These kids, they're kids. I mean, they're horrible assassins, murderers. I mean, the one kid, Fresita was his name, his homosexual name that he'd given himself. But he was famous for slicing a guy open and ripping his heart out while he was alive and eating it.
Jesus.
Like, and then you'd see him 2 seconds later, like being all like cuddly and giving kisses to this to this MS-13 guy, and you're like, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life.
It's I mean, it doesn't get much more Romeo and Juliet than that, right? That's like the ultimate Capulets and was it Montagues?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was just the most surreal thing, and it was kind of like, I thought that was my farewell Salvador piece, because after it came out, it was so bad. But I was like, well, it was worth it. This is a story that nobody ever has seen or could even imagine unless you saw it. But then eventually things calmed down a little bit, and I went back for another like 2 years, almost 3 years.
How did you find that story? Was it just someone was just like visiting the jail and noticed that there was like an awkward situation? Because that's kind of how I stumbled on the evangelical story. I was in, God, what is it? One of the cities outside San Salvador that had a bad reputation for murder, and we were in the jail, and it was the same thing. There was a cell of guys there was like it was like MS-13 cell, 18th Street cell, and this cell of like people mixed in. And I asked, what's the deal with those guys? And they were like, they're the ones who have converted to evangelical Christianity. They're the Christians.
Yeah.
And they were guys from both sides. And I was like, and then obviously like a year or two later, I reached out to you and we put that together. But, and you had been working on that separately. But was it just a situation like that where someone just noticed this like insane situation in another jail cell and was like, oh, that's a film right there?
Yeah, and it all ties back to that Christian movement. So there was this prison in Gotera that's like near the Honduran border, that the entire prison became famous, that had all the gang members were evangelical Christians. Everybody was an ex-gang member. And we did a few films inside that prison and became really good friends with the director. And then on just a normal visit, we would go, the doors were always wide open to visit the prison and kind of see what was going on. Victor Pena, a photographer from El Faro, was there and was like, well, what else can I see? And they took him. He's like, well, I've got this one corner that you've never seen before. Let me show you something crazy. And he took him and showed him. And Victor came back and called us all and was like, you guys won't believe what I just found. And so we immediately, everyone like went straight to Gotera. And the prison director knew he was going to get fired when Bukele took power. So he basically said, this month before Bukele wins, like takes control of the country, you guys can do whatever you want in the prison. Like the prison is your set. And so we had the full access to the prison for an entire month to make that film.
And it won a bunch of stuff, didn't it?
Yeah, I think we did close to 20 film festivals. It won like Photo of the Year, won Premio Gabo for Best Image, like Hot Docs, GIF, TIFF. It kind of did the rounds.
Yeah, the other story that I don't know if you ever did anything with it, but I think you're the one who told me it, that I always loved, was about the guerrillas from the retired guerrillas from the Civil War who had fought like in the 80s and 90s, and they're the only ones when the gangs were really and I don't know if this was an urban legend or not, but they're the only ones who kept the gangs out of their towns, because when the gang members showed up and tried to take over, they just like got murdered off one by one because these guys still had like their old like jungle warfare skills.
Yeah.
Is that ever like was that a real thing?
That is totally a true thing. And it's really interesting under like Bukele's martial law right now, because there are these communities that were completely controlled by former guerrillas. And as soon as everyone knew everybody in these communities. And so as soon as a kid showed up that wasn't from the community, everyone knew. And if it was a gang member, they said, you've got a day or two to leave. And if they didn't, they killed them and laid the body down in the square as a message to the rest of the gang members. So there were these whole communities that everyone knew were gang free, but under Bukele's martial law, the police were given quotas. And so the police were going into these communities and arresting a ton of just young guys And we're all on the outside. We know in that community historically has been gang free.
Yeah. I mean, that story itself, I guess there's an ending to it right there, right?
Yeah.
How awful it got. I think we're almost wrapping up, but also I wanted to like talk about something nice for a change. I remember staying with you out in, what was it, La Libertad, that area on the beach in El Salvador. I don't think people know El Salvador has like a kind of cool backpacker community, and there's like amazing surf spots there, and great like surfers from El Salvador and all that.
Yeah, I think that was like one of the saddest things for me to leave was like I was living right on the beach, and you could wake up in the morning and like literally walk for 5 minutes and then be at world-class surf and maybe 3 people in the water. Just like amazing, double overhead barrels, and it's just you and like a couple guys. It's definitely gotten a lot more touristy, and a lot more people have been coming in with all the they've had like a couple of the big world championships of surfing recently. But yeah, the country is beautiful and amazing, and the surf is just phenomenal. So I'm hoping to be able to go back. I just kind of want to see how things play out before I show my face there again.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you're a known entity, and that's probably a wise decision. Where can people see your work, or what do you have anything else coming up that's about to come out, or anything that just came out that you want people to watch?
Sure. So I just, neilbranvold.com so I freelance, so I'm working with different outlets. So I kind of throw everything on neilbranvold.com, but then I'm doing stuff with a couple films with Fault Lines. We just wrapped the film Transition, where we embed with the Taliban in Afghanistan with a journalist that's transitioning from female to male secretly behind the Taliban's back.
I saw it.
Yeah. Yeah, you saw it.
It's crazy. Well, because I know Monica, and she invited me to like one of the premieres in New York.
Oh, amazing.
And, yeah, it's crazy, man. It really keeps you on the edge of your seat for a lot of that film. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. So there's that one. And then, I'm headed, Mike Shum and I are headed back to Congo with M-23 coming back in and taking over a bunch of Eastern Congo yet again. We're headed back to see what those guys are doing.
Yeah, you've been working in Congo for years now, right?
Yeah, that's
decade.
That's like
maybe more.
I think my favorite spot in the world. It's like one of the toughest places to work, but it's just like super incredible. But yeah, M23 is back, and so we're heading back there in about a month to start covering that.
Awesome, dude. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I actually learned a lot in this, from knowing you for years and all that. But that was great. So thank you again, man. We really appreciate it.
Right on. Yeah, great talking. All right.